This is the In Context podcast with your host, Karin von Hippel.
Okay, well, this is Karin von Hippel, the Director General at RUSI, and it's a pleasure to welcome everyone to this month's edition of In Context, our podcast when we interview interesting individuals, influencers, and find out what makes them tick. And it's a great pleasure today to welcome Jan Hall, a new RUSI trustee. She's the founding partner of Number 4, which is a leadership and board advisory business, and she previously spent many years as a very top senior headhunter in the city. So welcome, Jan.
Good afternoon.
Now, in these podcasts, what we do is we like to start out early on a bit in your life. I mean, not too early, but early enough, and just follow your career. And then we'll ask you about your views on various issues as and when we move along your progression. So let's start out with, unless there's something very exciting about your childhood in Cheshire, I thought I might start out with your degree in biochemistry from Oxford. Now, why did you choose biochemistry? You were an early STEM person.
Actually, biochemistry at that stage was a lot less interesting than it is now. But actually, it was very, the kind of decision a schoolgirl makes is that I loved chemistry and biology was my second favorite. So biochemistry seemed like a good way of combining the two. Of course, it's not either. But anyway, that was the thinking at the time.
And did you think you were going to be a doctor, or you thought maybe you'd go into, pharmaceuticals, or what were you thinking?
I thought that I would go and work in the pharmaceutical arena. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Now, on your personal interests, we have that you like to walk, you like music, you like film, you like wine, and you like keeping up a busy social life, which has probably been pretty hard to do in the last year, right?
Well, I have tried hard, but it hasn't been entirely ideal, it's fair to say.
You could combine a few. You and I did a walk and talk, so that was nice.
I've done a lot of walking and talking. Yeah.
Yes. You're a serious walker, as I noticed. It's hard to keep up with you. Okay, so in many ways, you're not a typical trustee for RUSI. You come from a city background, of a corporate background. You've been a very senior figure in the city for many years, and most CEOs, corporate CEOs, know you quite well. I saw you were recently listed one of the 30 most influential people in the city of London in the Financial Times a few years back. So maybe we can talk a bit about your career and how you ended up doing what you're doing now. And then we'll talk about how that interacts with RUSI. So I think I noticed you had a few years working in the private sector before you became a headhunter. I remember you telling me you didn't intend to go into headhunting. You didn't even really think about it, right? Can you remind me of what happened there?
No, well, I wanted to be the CEO of a business, and I started life in what was then called ICI, which, if you're young now, you don't even know ICI, but at the time it was a great place to go as a graduate. And I did marketing. And then I set up a business which we grew and built and sold. And then I went to be the CEO of a publicly quoted company for a number of years. And then I had my son. And at that point, I decided it would be great to do something where I had more control over my time. And so I sat down in a very logical way and looked at the options, one of which was becoming a headhunter because I had been headhunted to be a headhunter. And much to my annoyance, every time I worked out in a logical way what gave me what I was looking for, this headhunting option came up high. So I went into it with my head rather than my heart. And for the first year, my heart struggled. But actually, after a year, I realized I just loved it and I could use everything I'd learned in the past. And I was learning new stuff and meeting new fascinating people every day. So it turned out to be, for me, a brilliant thing to do.
Yeah, I mean, it's always interesting. I always think that, it's like solving a puzzle. You have a gap and you need to find the right person with the right skill set that can fit this particular community and this particular way of working. And that's not an easy thing to do. And people make probably more mistakes in hiring, even if somebody looks good on paper. So you have to really think very carefully about what's needed in the company. And I suppose at the senior levels, which is what you were working at, it's a whole different set of things that you have to worry about too.
Yes, and actually at the, if you're working at the top of business, which is what I was doing, then you are thinking of the person, of the right fit for a person, but you're also trying to work out what the organization is trying to achieve, and sometimes in order to get the right fit, you might even be talking with the client about reshaping their organization in some way. So it's very much about really thinking, I mean, this is called In Context as a podcast, but it's actually thinking about the person in the context of what it is that you want them to do and the fit at the time. And having run businesses before I became a headhunter, and I then went on to run my own headhunting business, but having run businesses, I made some horrendous mistakes in hiring people. I made some great choices too, but I made some big mistakes. And what I learned, and certainly I learned from Spencer Stewart, where I went, and then the firm that I and my partners built, was part of it is also, and actually it fits with Rusi in a way, it's not spying, but it is doing really deep due diligence to really understand about the person. Because at the very senior levels, if somebody doesn't present themselves well, then that's interesting of itself, but most people do. So actually doing your homework and about understanding how they've been experienced in other organizations, on other boards or whatever, by other people is crucially important. And that's the thing that de-risks hiring. So that was if I learned one thing, it was you have to use your instincts, but not to just trust only your instincts. You have to really do your homework. And so having great researchers, great people around who are going to understand what's going on in an industry and the role somebody's played and how they've played it and their personality, all of that matters enormously if you're going to minimize the risk of hiring. You can never be certain, but you can minimize the risk.
So, Jan, you were saying headhunting is not just about finding the right leader for an organization, but sometimes you even help them think about restructuring. Is that what you meant? To restructure an organization itself or parts of an organization?
Well, probably restructuring a top team rather than, and so that then leads to the organization. But it's about working out with the client what it is they're trying to achieve, what it is that might fit to that. And if they've got a problem with finding the right fit, why is that? And so it might well be an organizational issue, it might be a people issue. So a lot of, at the very top, headhunting is finding people, but it's also actually really trying to help and work with the client as an advisor as to how to make that best work. So not always by any means, but some of the time.
Is there an example that you can share without naming names of an interesting case?
Yes. Somebody that I had worked with previously before I became a headhunter, who came to me and said, I've worked with two of the big headhunting firms. I have not solved my problem. And I remember that you're a problem solver. Here's my problem. And so I spent some real time with him just understanding not just what had gone wrong with the recruitments or the hires, but what had gone wrong in terms of the organization. What was he trying to solve? And what we ended up doing in that case was saying, well, actually, the problem is that you can't find somebody who's going to come into a role to be the CEO in a relatively short period of time without having a bigger span of control. So he was looking for a CEO successor. And so what you were doing was then saying, you need to think about timescales, you need to think about how you redefine a role, how you structure around to create the right role. And in that particular situation, in fact, what happened is that they talked to the CEO, who then stayed for a bit longer, and they were able to bring somebody in who had 2 to 3 years to grow into a job. Whereas somebody who was already ready to be the CEO is not going to sit under somebody for a couple of years. So it's just a question of always understanding what's the problem and then how do you solve it in order to then be able to go out and find the right person.
And did you specialize in a certain type of company? I mean, in other words, you have to know about the aviation industry to put somebody in top of Boeing, for example, or a defense company.
I was incredibly lucky because although I had run businesses, they'd always been advisory businesses. So I was used to working with a wide range of industries before I became a headhunter. And if you're working at the top of the FTSE, which is really where I was working, then actually sometimes it is industry specific, but other times it's about finding the right leadership skills to be able to go into a business. So I was one of the lucky people in the sense that the broad generalist role was still very available at that stage, and I was able to do that. It's much harder now because people come up through silos, and so being able to be a CEO and chairman generalist is a tougher thing to do, but it's still possible because in the end, at that very top level, it's really understanding the leadership role that matters more than the sector role, and so you then work with sector specialists, but you understand that fit of leadership at the very top.
Yes, that makes sense to me because you often see people going into an adjacent field as a leader, but obviously they have a skill that you think they can bring to that particular industry. So you do have to break out of the silos to understand those leaps.
Yeah, absolutely.
So you did that for 22 years at the top, and then you sold your company and transitioned only in 2019 to your own. You set up your own company, which is called Number 4, and it's a C-suite advisory firm, right?
Yeah.
And what was it that made you decide it was time to make a change?
Well, the opportunity arose to sell our business, and we were able to then put it into one of the big global headhunters in a way that we could take the whole team from, it was called JCA, from JCA into that team. And it was the perfect fit. And so on the face of it, it looked right. And so we made the decision to actually join a big firm, partly because what was happening and is still happening is that those very big global CEO roles, you need to be able to do a global search. And although we did do that, if you're based in London primarily, then it's quite hard for clients of very big companies, and particularly the boards of very big companies, to feel confident that you can really cover the ground very internationally. And so the time came when actually there was a kind of business imperative, but also we were growing quite top heavy. So it was a chance for everybody to be able to spread their wings and do more amongst the partner group.
And did you stay at all during that transition, or did you leave?
So I did stay and expected to stay for longer. But actually, if you are somebody who's seen organizations for a long time, and I'd also sold a business before and been in a business where I made lots of acquisitions, it just became clear to me relatively quickly that I wasn't going to find what I needed. And so I talked to them, and we came to a very amicable agreement that they would let me go earlier than either of us had expected. And so it wasn't anticipated, but actually I think we came to a really good end place. But I loved working with the senior clients. I'd given them my word I wouldn't be a headhunter again. But actually, I also was at a point where I wanted to change, but I wanted to use what I knew, and I loved the clients I worked with. And so Number 4 is a way of working with those chairmen and CEOs who I knew from the past in a different way, and to use everything I'd learned in a different way with them.
And so you do everything now from tell them they may need to hire a new senior person,
a new CEO,
or to help them restructure the way they do business, or is it more I think you're a coach as well. So is it more coaching, professional coaching?
It's going into organizations to help them. And sometimes it's via a board review where you're going in and helping them to see how their board is working with the executive team and how that might move forward. Sometimes it's an organization at a point of transition where you're helping them to think through what are the key areas that they need to focus on to get that transition right. Sometimes it is coaching somebody who's going to be the next CEO or is a new CEO. And sometimes it is advising the chairman and the CEO when they have decided that they've got a longer term succession plan coming. So it's not a business that I'm not trying to grow a business now. I'm just enjoying working with people who know me and who trust me. And so they will come to me and say, will you help with this?
And you've been doing that for about 2 years now, right?
Yep.
Wow. And are you enjoying it still? Are you enjoying the lifestyle change?
I'm absolutely loving it. Yeah. I've got some more time for me, and I'm still doing really interesting stuff. I feel very, very lucky.
Okay. So let's talk a little bit about your interest in RUSI. I remember when I was looking for someone with exactly your profile, I was hoping for someone who understood the corporate world, city and the corporate world, who could bring that kind of expertise, those networks, and also someone, with a headhunting background, someone who understands diversity. Because of course we've been working very hard at RUSI to improve our diversity in many ways of our governing bodies and elsewhere. So, I was really delighted that I found you through some connections. And I remember you first being a little bit confused about what you could bring to RUSI. But then I think when you started this new job, I think you understood fairly quickly, given how crazy the world has been and how important it is for C-suite executives to understand the evolving security, geopolitical dynamics, right?
Absolutely. And for me, RUSI, because I hadn't thought that I would join boards because I'm advising boards rather than joining them. But actually, RUSI is a very good complement to that world, and it's bringing something very different. because it's actually understanding, as you say, that big geopolitical piece and the security piece in all of its different ways. So it meant I would learn, but also I hope that I'd be able to kind of bring the piece I understood once you'd explained to me why it might fit.
Once you understood what the heck you were doing with us. And so far, I mean, I know it's been a little bit more difficult to be a trustee, mostly during the lockdown, but do you feel like you've been able to bring anything back to your clients?
I think understanding just how brilliant, I did know because I'd met people from GCHQ and from, our security services in the past, and particularly from the armed forces when they'd come out, as people had asked me to meet them. But actually sitting in on a lot of the RUSI, they've all been webinars really, but sitting in on them, hearing people, the depth and expertise that there is here in the UK and, that then cooperates and collaborates globally is just extraordinary to understand. And I'm not sure that many people really do understand how wide and deep it goes.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I think in your career, the way your company right now, you're obviously helping people deal with incredible complexity and uncertainty. The world is in an incredibly complex and uncertain place right now in transitions. And so I think there must be parallels between how one would advise governments to manage these uncertain times and how one advises senior leaders.
Absolutely. And, you only have to look to what's going on in America right now. So the issue about being able to take a broader perspective and then work out, how one is a straight arrow through that. And companies have a real responsibility to the communities in which they operate. So they need to and want to understand that much, much more. And then, I think the good companies and certainly the publicly listed companies, what you've seen them say through the pandemic and you've seen in America them say through the whole Trump thing is, we want to be able to make society a better place in which we can work. And we also need to be able to navigate the risks in society and the cyber risks, which at the moment we're going to transform massively. What the pandemic has done from the business world is that everybody's digital models have been accelerated in a way that nobody had anticipated. And so suddenly the importance of cybersecurity and also the importance of non-fake news really, really matters, not even more, but so much more than anybody had expected so fast and so quickly. So I think what RUSI is doing becomes much more relevant to how companies actually stay as that straight arrow, help to build the societies in which they're operating, and also help to actually build themselves so they're future-proofing themselves.
Right. I mean, I would imagine in the private sector, there have been some real winners and some losers, and then a bunch of companies that are probably in the middle trying to just navigate their way through this mess. And what they all end up doing after the pandemic will be interesting to see, because there will be some significant transformations, as you've said. So it's quite an interesting time to be in the middle of it all, I would say.
It couldn't be more interesting at the moment, but actually I think it will become more interesting because right now people are slightly in battlefield mode, to use a RUSI term. But once the battle is cleared, and then you're kind of looking ahead as to where you go. And clearly the leaders of the big businesses are doing that right now, but still they're flipping between battlefield and future. And there's going to come a point, one hopes, in the next year or two, if there's not too many mutant variants, there's going to come a point where people are going to have to really rethink what they're doing as their total focus. Yeah, absolutely.
What do you think might happen for the future of work? I mean, do you think most companies will adopt this hybrid approach of working at home and in the office going forward? I mean, it'll be really, these are fundamental shifts in the way we think about our professional lives.
It's really interesting. The jury is still out. And I think what we're learning now, I think if we had been locked down until last autumn and then unlocked, we might have all gone, oh, it's quite nice to work from home for a bit. But I think if we're now locked down for another 3 months and much of the developed world is locked down for all that time, people are just, as somebody said to me yesterday, most people are putting a brave face on it now, but they're pretty miserable underneath. And so we are social creatures. So at a very sort of visceral level, we need to be with each other. But also, I do worry that organizations are beginning, and not just corporate organizations, but any organization, if you haven't been together and you haven't seen each other, then you're beginning to fly blind. Mm-hmm. And that feels quite scary to me. And I think this year, feels much more risky than last year, because last year we were kind of just coping. This year we're back to sort of business as usual, but it's not remotely usual. And so people are, I think, beginning to understand more and more and more that all that stuff that happens when you are just together as people, and when you travel around the world and meet people and you see and sense and smell what's going on in their different parts of your organization or other people's organizations, the richness in that and the data that you get from that much bigger interaction is just becoming more and more clear to people. So I'm not convinced that the working from home is going to be as big as people think it is. I mean, it will be maybe for people who are towards the end of their careers, who've built their relationships, who are really strong in their professional expertise. So there will be places where people can absolutely do that, and they will. But I'm not convinced it's going to be everybody.
Yeah, it's very interesting because you certainly notice it when you go and actually interact with somebody for a work reason. I mean, I'm a bit of an extrovert, so I get a bit of a buzz out of it. And you forget that that's actually the way you generate ideas and all sorts of things. But I imagine even if we go back and we're still part-time at home and part-time at work, it's going to still be a bit fragmented because we won't necessarily all be in and out in the same time. So that'll be another type of transition that we'll have to figure out as well.
Yeah. So I think what is for sure is that we will become much more digital in the way that we interact with each other. So the virtual world will not go away. And people have learned that you don't have to jump on planes for an hour's meeting and all that kind of easy stuff that you've learned. And quite a lot of the sort of transactional stuff that happens within businesses where it's kind of processy or it's data-based, you can do more of that virtually. But the danger in all of that is that people who, if people are doing something that can be done anywhere in the world, if you can be anywhere, then there are people who are really smart and who can do those things in countries where they get paid a lot less money. So I think that's also people are going to start to realize that their jobs are under threat if they simply stay at home. So the pressure for people to kind of come back and be part of the community from the people themselves is going to be quite a lot of different factors at play here. And in the end, organizations, really, the most important thing in any organization is the people and the culture. Mm-hmm. And if you don't get that right, then you don't have a company to then build out from. So I don't know, but I think that we are more likely to be less WFH than people thought.
Yeah, I mean, it's, the few times that I have met people for work purposes, seeing them in 3D again was very exciting. Although, as one person pointed out, you can't mute people anymore when you're with them. But the quality of interaction when you're with somebody is so much higher. Yeah, it's also, I don't know if you're lucky enough to enjoy what you do, and many of us are. You enjoy it because you're doing it with other people. Yeah, you're a social creature. So can we talk a little bit about diversity? Because I think you've probably seen the impacts of whatever it is, whether it's gender, ethnic, or other types of diversity, getting organizations to change, moving beyond tokenism on boards, et cetera. Tell us a little bit about what you've learned over the years in that space, working in the kind of corporate culture, really. I mean, I think we've still got a long way to go. Mm-hmm. And BLM, in a sense, in terms of ethnic diversity, really brought that to the fore. But if you look at the top of most organizations, certainly on the executive side, I mean, boards are kind of easy, but the executive side, which is where it really matters, you've still got many more men running these businesses than women. So, and women do, they do a lot of the things that men do as well, if not better, but they also bring something different as well. And so organizations have still not learned how to really make it work for women at the top. And I think there's just no question through the pandemic that the need for diversity of thought is absolutely essential as well. So I haven't seen any boardrooms recently not wanting to embrace more diversity. And I don't think there are any, but I think that is arguably easier. I don't think there are any CEOs around now who aren't trying to do that very hard, but it's a long-term project, and it needs to be, you need to sow the seeds and nurture them and then make tough choices. And I was certainly wrong over boards, because as somebody who spent, a chunk of her time helping to get people appointed to boards, there was a point where,
you would look at CVs, and the CVs, in a sense, or the people in their backgrounds, there would be many more men that were obviously qualified for what the company, the board was looking for. And actually, once we shifted to say there is no choice, you have to appoint a woman, then lots of great women were found and lots of great women stepped up, and not all of them. And, I don't want to overclaim, but actually, I think having started out going, this is difficult because there aren't enough qualified women on that score, I came round to believing that actually forcing that was exactly the right thing to do. And my very great friend, Helen Alexander, who was a big champion for that, who so sadly died towards the end of that time, she was completely right about really championing women, but there's just so much more to do.
Yeah.
And it obviously it isn't just women.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I mean, it drives me a bit crazy when people say, well, we don't have enough qualified candidates. Well, that means we're not looking in the right places and we're not trying hard enough.
Yeah. And the good news is that people have now got that you have to try harder. And I think the other thing is, when I first came into headhunting, a lot of the chairmen would put a woman on the board and then not help them. And if you're new to something, you need supporting and nurturing. And I think, again, companies and boards have understood you need to do that. Boards, it's relatively easy. Inside companies, it is harder. And so there's still much, much more work to be done.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. And then, of course, you have, even though you said you don't sit on many boards, it looks like from your CV, you've sat on quite a few actually over the years, a mixture of non-exec positions and then charities. Are there any that, that stand out to you that, you think you've learned a lot from, or that you really enjoyed?
Gosh, actually, all of them. I mean, I think it is a real privilege sitting on a board because you get a bird's eye view of an organization. And I don't think there's any of them where I haven't learned. Gosh, I mean, very hard to say which have I learned most from. I just think it's a brilliant thing to be able to do. Well, I did learn about how difficult it was to do deals, and very wonderful Roger Wiggs, who's long retired now, but Roger, who was at the time the CEO of what was Securicor, we had to sign a deal in the middle of the night, and he was in hospital in Wales. And persuaded the nurses to wheel his hospital bed to the fax machine to sign the document so that we could get the deal done before 8 o'clock or whenever the markets opened the next morning. So BSM, I think if you asked all of the members of that board, that night where we were all trying to get Roger to be able to get the deal done. So there's lots of human things in that as well. But being part of helping to shape where an organization is going and being part of being able to support and challenge the CEO is a great privilege.
Yeah, right. No, I mean, I appreciate everything the trustees bring to us. And I think you're right. We do need to always be thinking about people who can challenge us and think differently too. Diversity of thought, as you say. And then, of course, you got an OBE in 1996 for your services to the Department of Trade and Industry. And congratulations on that. And you've written 2 books. So let's briefly talk about both of them. The first one is called Dementia Essentials. It's a guide for carers looking after someone with dementia. And it was you wrote this following the death of your mother from Alzheimer's. Is that right?
It is, yeah. It was kind of, my father and I, after she died, we sat talking about her and how sad we were. But we also said, gosh, we both learned so much. And it was really hard yards to do the learning. Because at that stage, there were lots of books about this is what happened with my mother, or this is what happened to my husband, or whatever. But there weren't books which were really bringing together the experiences of lots of carers to help carers to cope with somebody who's got dementia. And if you've seen, I mean, I wasn't the main carer, my father was, I helped him. But if you have seen the path that dementia takes, and there are lots of different forms of dementia, but whether it's Alzheimer's or vascular dementia or whatever, basically your neurons are dying, so your brain is disintegrating. And looking after somebody whose brain is just not functioning, and you lose your person before you lose their body. I cannot begin to describe how awful it is. And what we were trying to do, and lots of friends and colleagues who'd experienced it too, we all contributed to a book which pulled together the lessons to be able to help people and try and make them feel a bit less alone. So we've actually just, with a friend's daughter whose grandmother's got dementia now, we've just updated it. And so there's a new version from last September. And I just hope it helps people to partly to anticipate what's coming, because we're still big on denial around dementia. And actually, if you can push through that denial and spend some time trying to think about what you need to put in place for the future, you can make it a bit easier. But, there's no
it's
panacea.
so challenging. I mean, we're all living longer, but then, of course, living longer means you have different types of illnesses as you get older, too.
It is a disease of the elderly. But the thing that only 25% of people understand that dementia is a disease still. It isn't a natural part of aging. Dementia is a disease and it kills you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's so sad to watch people just completely become different people, as you say. And then you wrote another book that maybe we can talk about that sounds also really fascinating, called Changing Gear. And that's actually coming out in the next month or so. And it's for people who are transitioning from a big, giant, important job to figure out what they want to be when they grow up, essentially, right?
Or figure out what they want to be now that they are very grown up.
Right. So tell us a bit about that, why you wrote that, and what you talk about.
Okay. Well, I wrote this one with a sort of professional friend, John Stokes, who is originally a clinical psychologist, but one of the top coaches in the UK on leadership. And we were sat in my garden, both of us having given up on our full-time jobs, talking about how difficult it was to let go. And the fact that both of us had loved what we'd done, we'd both made our own decisions to do this, and yet we were still struggling with it. And we'd watched lots of people do that. So why was it we couldn't just take the lessons that we'd learned from other people and apply them to ourselves? What was going on? And it was that afternoon or sort of lunch in the sun in my garden that triggered the thinking that then led us to say, gosh, it might be fun to write a book. So this was part of our next steps. And what we realized was there's this thing which we've called the third life. And it comes, if you look at the Hindu religion, they have 4 stages in life: the student stage, the kind of becoming a grown up, getting a house, having a family, having children. The 4th phase is the kind of really pulling back, fully retired, getting, wisdom and sadly death. But there's this 3rd phase they have, which they call the forest dweller, where you've kind of done your bit for the world. And then the idea is that you go into the forest and think about how you can come back into your community and give back. I mean, that's probably John and I, in a sense, making that Hindu idea work for us. So what we were trying to get at was, when you get to the point where you are going to make, what do you, rather than just rushing to fill it with other things because it's very scary not to have other things, stopping and thinking through what you want to be and how you want to live, but also hopefully for some people how you can also do some giving back.
Oh, wow, that's fascinating. I think it applies to so many people. I mean, I actually have become an informal coach in some ways at RUSI, because we have so many people who are very generous with their time once they retire from these big jobs, but they sometimes haven't ever had another job besides the one job that they've had. And so it's quite stressful, I think, making that change. And sometimes I just say, well, what are you going to do tomorrow morning when you wake up? Because, they're so used to somebody else filling their schedule and organizing their day and all sorts of things. And so it is a big change, and people handle it in so many different ways. So I'm sure this book would come in, very handy. I think I might start recommending that going forward.
Yeah, well, it is definitely, again, we were talking earlier about with COVID, people, we're all putting a brave face on it. But I think it is something that before you're into having to face that, you don't understand how tough it is. And it is, for some people, it's unbelievably tough. For others, they're very lucky and it's not tough. But for most of us, if you're giving up something that you love that is very full on, you need time to kind of grieve and let go of what you've lost, but you also need time to think about what you want to move towards. And it takes time and it takes thought. And that's what we've tried to do in the book, is to really open up the different ways you might think about it and a plan for how you kind of can expect it to take time, rather than you can kind of just decide to do something and the next day wake up and be a new person, because it just doesn't work like that. It's not like rebooting a computer, as John would say.
Right. And I think some people, not many, but some people, their egos, get a little bit carried away. They don't always realize that the reason people are being so nice to them is because of their job. And so I think some of those people have a tougher time in transition than others.
They do. I remember a couple of years ago, somebody took me to the top restaurant in New York and had the top table in the restaurant. And he said, actually, what people really struggle with is that, if you are in one of the biggest jobs in New York, every door opens to you. But the minute you're not in that job, those doors just don't open at all.
Right.
It's as if you'd never been there. And that is unbelievably difficult because we're all very human. And
Right.
a lot of those things that go with big jobs are very wonderful things. Yeah.
Right. No, I've seen that a lot. And you see it a lot in government and in politics as well. You're the
Absolutely.
leader, you're in a senior position, and then all of a sudden you don't have the driver. And there's that perennial joke. I think it came from Kissinger after he stepped down when he got into the back of his car and it didn't move. You do hear that quite often. And, some people are totally fine with it because they probably realized from day one, it's not me, it's the job. But I suspect there are some people who actually thought it was them.
Yeah. And actually, I think if you do it for a long time, it's really hard. Even if you are pretty down to earth and you've got a family that keep your feet on the ground, it's still hard.
Yeah. Because you just get used to a certain way of life.
Mm.
Yeah. Well, very interesting. It sounds like, you've done so many interesting things and you're still going strong and coming up with lots of ways to help people cope with complexity. And so it's a really important topic to be thinking about now. We are,
and especially post the pandemic.
Well, post pandemic,
it's given everybody time. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So we're coming a bit to the end of our time, and I always like to end these interviews by asking what advice you would give younger people today, because of course the world has changed so much. I think in the time that we've been professionals, and if you're just coming straight out of uni now, thinking about what you want to be when you grow up, what advice would you give those younger people?
Well, I'd probably tell them not to trust the grown-ups. Because actually it is so different now than it was when their parents and their parents' friends, etc., went into the world of work. So actually finding their own way, that doesn't mean to say not listening to other people and getting support isn't important. And I think expecting that you're going to find the thing that you do forever is much less common now. So being able to cope with ambiguity, being able to expect, or not being able to, but coping with change so that you know that things are going to move differently. And I think that therefore means, a huge, on the one hand, pragmatism to not try and find the perfect thing because you've got to be realistic about finding your way through.
Mm-hmm.
And on the other hand, actually, if you have got a passion, not being frightened to pursue it. And so I think you've got to be very flexible about how you meet your goals if you know what they are. And if you don't, then actually not giving yourself a hard time for not knowing. But actually, it's what we say in our book about when you're thinking about what next in your third life. It's actually experimenting. If you don't know, it's experimenting and being open to new things and being prepared to learn and listen. So I think if I could give people going into the world of work now advice, it would be to really listen, to be really open to things, and to be really flexible. And as the buzzword of the last few years has been, to be agile, to expect change and kind of and embrace it to the extent that we humans can do that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that makes sense. And in fact, I think people learn as much from failed jobs because they know what they don't like, or they learn what they're not as good at, and then necessarily finding the right thing right away, don't they?
Absolutely, yes.
Well, Jen Holt, it's been an enormous pleasure talking to you today. We thank you so much for your time, and look forward to seeing you back at RUSI, hopefully in the very near future.
Well, really look forward to actually seeing you at some stage.
Exactly. Well, thank you again. Thank you for listening to today's podcast. We always appreciate any comments, positive or negative. Please email them to us or tweet us at RUSI_org or #InContext. All the podcasts are on the RUSI website, so please do go back and listen to any of the ones that you have missed and send us comments.
This podcast was produced by Tom Ascott, developed by Caroline Tranter, with further research from Neil Watling. Keep up to date with the latest defence and security analysis by visiting www.rusi.org.